begin our next panel.
Good morning. You know, in all reality, I think this conference needs to go for a couple of weeks, because after the first panel, we need at least a couple of days to fully digest it and process it and take in all the learning and accept it and work through all of that stuff. But we push right on, and our panel is titled, Getting Past the Racial Past. I am Alice Faulkner Burch, and I am the moderator of this panel. On this panel, we have Professor Paul Reeve. He is the Simmons Professor of Mormon Studies in the History Department at the University of Utah, where he teaches courses on Utah history, Mormon history, and the history of the U.S. His book, Religion of a Different Color, Race and the Mormon Struggle for Whiteness, received 3 Best Book Awards. In 2016, the Utah Council for the Social Studies named Professor Reeve its University Teacher of the Year. He is building a digital database, A Century of Black Mormons, which you saw at the beginning. If you were here at the very beginning, he showed that, to name and identify all known black Mormons between 1830 and 1930. And so pretty soon the world will know that there are actually more than 30 of us. Ahmad Corbitt is a director in the Public Affairs Department of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He is a former director of the LDS Church's New York Office of Public and International Affairs. Corbitt has been a regular lecturer and moderator on religious freedom, interfaith relations, and public affairs, including at a variety of universities, the Council on Foreign Relations, and the United Nations campus in New York. A former vice president and general counsel of a New York public communications firm and trial lawyer, Corbitt is a member of the bars of New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. He received a BA in sociology from Richard Stockton College of New Jersey and a Juris Doctorate from Rutgers University School of Law. He is a member of various professional and academic organizations. In 2014, he received the Norman Vincent Peale Award for Positive Thinking. Corbitt has served as a stake president and as a mission president. Wain Myers is a native of Dayton, Ohio. He earned his BS in computer science from Independence University, where he graduated summa cum laude and was class valedictorian. He is a member of the Alpha Beta Kappa Honors Fraternity. He enlisted in the United States Army in 1988 and served in the 2nd Division of the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment. There, he received his call to the ministry. After his military career, Wain returned to the U.S. and preached at True Vine Missionary Baptist Church in Dayton, Ohio. During that time, he was introduced to the LDS Church. His conversion story was published in October 2015 by Cedar Fork Publishing Company in the best-selling book From Baptist Preacher to Mormon Teacher. Wain has been an active member in the LDS Church since 1995 and has served twice on the Stake High Council and was the second counselor in the Genesis Presidency. I am Alice Faulkner Burch. I was born and raised in Oxnard, California, and my mama is Awanda Dale, and my daddy is Cleo Everett Faulkner. I've been a member of the church 34 years. I served a full-time mission in Chile, Santiago South Mission. I served an inner city mission. I call it a mission. The church doesn't, but it was for me. I served for 5 years at the Utah State Men's Prison. I retired last year from full-time employment and opened my own business that I call Ask Mama Alice, which works with white parents who have adopted black children. So we will proceed. I want to tell you about our panel. This panel addresses racial issues in the LDS Church since the 78 policy change. It asks what progress has been made, what has stayed the same, and what still needs to change. And these are the presentations that you will hear. Paul Reeve will outline the historical context and examine the lingering impact of whiteness on Mormonism. I keep saying this. Ahmad, could you just really spell your name the way it sounds, honey? Because I keep saying Ahmad. So, I'm visual. Ahmad Corbitt will address the church's outreach toward blacks and what that outreach might suggest about contemporary senior church leaders' perspectives on blacks in the present and future of the church. Wain Myers was recently released from the Genesis Presidency and is the author of From Baptist Preacher to Mormon Teacher. He will consider the role of Genesis on the African American community from the perspective of Salt Lake City and from his experience in Genesis outside of Utah. I will discuss things that the church has done to move itself and its members forward. And since I'm the moderator, I get to go first because I'm really nervous. So I did this research, compiling it along the way, and I'm just going to rattle it all off, okay? The church leadership, public affairs, and those personnel directly responsible for what is published are striving towards change of removing falsehoods from public announcements and manuals, teaching truth, and becoming more aligned with the Scriptures. A brief summary list of actions that indicate this willingness and desire are the following. April 2006, President Hinckley makes a turning point statement, quote, "No man who makes disparaging remarks concerning those of another race can consider himself a true disciple of Christ, nor can he consider himself to be in harmony with the teachings of the church." February 2012, issued statement, quote, "We do not tolerate racism in any form," unquote. March 2013, major changes to scriptures for first time in 30 years, which include removal of footnote cross-reference of dark and skin of blackness from the Book of Mormon as referring to being cursed, rewritten chapter headings, and new intro of official declaration number 2 that explains that black men were ordained under Joseph Smith. December 2013, the essay on race and the priesthood is written and authorized by upper leadership to be put on the official website. August 13th, 2017, regarding the racist rioting in Charlottesville, Virginia, an official statement reiterated President Hinckley's words of 2006 and added, quote, "Our prayers are with those who are suffering because of this intolerance and hatred," unquote. The first time ever sympathy towards black people is shown. August 15th, 2017. Following a well-known white supremacist rant that the church backs her, an official statement was issued, quote, "There are some among the various pro-white and white supremacy communities who assert that the church is neutral toward or in support of their views. Nothing could be further from the truth. White supremacist attitudes are morally wrong and sinful, and we condemn them. Church members who promote or pursue this agenda are not in harmony with the teachings of the church." In 2017, hired a black man as the Director of Public Affairs for the first time. Also in 2017, church leadership and public affairs forms an all-black member committee to work with public affairs. This committee also organized the B1 celebration. Also 2017, the church removed the restriction of not being able to serve in the temple if divorced, a restriction mostly impacting black men and that prevented them from being temple ordinance workers. February 2018. Family searched at Africa Ancestry Day at Roots Tech. Newsroom reported on Ontario's Black History Society conference, and the church had a booth there. Fully supported Utah Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society's Black Community Welcome Reception during Roots Tech with location and funds. Fully supported the newly formed Black LDS Legacy's first conference with location and funds. April 2018, several general authority talks mentioned racism as a sin during conference. First Presidency meets with NAACP national leadership and makes joint announcement against racism. Darius Gray is asked to write article on healing from wounds of racism for official website. First Presidency hosts luncheon for Utah's Black community. June 2018. Okay. All month it was first, but we're going to list them. Darius Gray's article appears in Ensign with 7 other articles on racism and the priesthood restriction, an issue to commemorate the 40th anniversary of the restriction removal. Supported and reported on celebration of the Juneteenth in Sacramento, California. First ever global announcement of and global broadcast of the priesthood anniversary, and it's fully supported by the First Presidency. First Black LDS Artifacts exhibit at the Church History Library. First Black History display commemorating restriction removal at Church History Museum. Public conversation on racism took place in the Church History Library with many heavyweight church headquarter personnel present who are responsible for publications, public information, and church releases. President Oaks issues a church-wide call for all members to repent of prejudice during a church-wide broadcast. That was the B1 celebration. President Nelson emanates a joy not seen before as he closes the B1 celebration. Upcoming change to hymn book and children's songbook to, quote, reflect the diverse needs of the global church, unquote, Elder Rasband states. These are the things that we can see on a timeline that have been done. And we will go from here, starting with Ahmad Corbitt. I'm sorry, starting with Paul Reeve.
So as the historian on the panel, it's my task to try to help us understand how the LDS Church arrived at June of 1978 in need of a revelation to remove race-based priesthood and temple restrictions. So I wanted to share with you some of the lessons I've learned as I've researched this over the last decade or so. The first lesson is simply that in the first couple of decades of Mormonism, Mormons created an inclusive racial vision. Let me give you some evidence to support that claim. Joseph Smith claims to receive at least 4 revelations instructing him that the gospel must be preached unto every creature, with signs following them that believe. Latter-day Saints like to say unto every nation, kindred, tongue, and people. We have 4 revelations that say every creature. There's no wiggle room. And in fact, early Latter-day Saints seemed to take this notion seriously. Other evidence, 1833, William Phelps publishing a Mormon newspaper in Jackson County, Missouri. So long as we have no special rule in the church as to people of color, let prudence guide. There is no special rule. If you want to suggest the racial restrictions are in place from the beginning, you have to argue against the evidence. Phelps is inviting Black Latter-day Saints to gather to Zion, which has been defined as Jackson County, Missouri. He's afraid they will run afoul of Missouri slave laws. They have to have papers that substantiate their status as freed blacks, and he quotes 2 sections of the Missouri State Code telling them if they gather to Zion without freed papers, they will be subject to being whipped and expelled from the state. We, meaning Latter-day Saints, have no special rule in the church as to people of color, but the state of Missouri does. Therefore, just be prudent if you're going to gather to Zion with us. Other evidence is simply the fact that under Joseph Smith's leadership, black men were ordained to the priesthood. Elijah Abel is the most well-documented black priesthood holder in 19th century Mormon history. He's ordained 3rd of March 36. There's a certificate signed the 30th of March by Joseph Smith himself, which is on display in the LDS Church History Library this month. He's then later that same year ordained a member of the 3rd Quorum of the 70 on the 20th of December, 1836. He also receives washing and anointing rituals in the Kirtland Temple, is among the earliest to perform baptisms for the dead in Nauvoo. He then moves to Cincinnati and will eventually immigrate to Utah. 1853, upon his arrival in the Salt Lake Valley, like was typical in the 19th century, he was rebaptized in 1853 to signify his recommitment to the Mormon faith. In 1857, as a part of the Mormon Reformation, baptized again. You want to challenge his commitment to Mormonism? How about 3 baptisms? And how about serving 3 missions as an ordained priesthood holder? Other evidence of an open racial vision. At Nauvoo, the saints publish their expectation of who will gather to Nauvoo. They envision people from every land and from every nation. The polished European, the degraded Hottentot, and the shivering Laplander flowing to that city. And then they also envisioned those who would come and worship with them in the temple under construction. They anticipated persons of all languages and of every tongue and of every color who shall with us worship the Lord of hosts in his holy temple and offer up their horizons in his sanctuary. You can go all the way to March of 1847 with Brigham Young on record with an open racial vision. If you want to argue the restrictions in place from the beginning, you have to argue against the evidence. Brigham Young, 3 years after Joseph Smith is dead, is on record with an open racial vision. William McCary is a baptized Latter-day Saint who complains to Brigham Young in winter quarters that he's not being treated fairly as a result of his racial identity. Brigham Young responds, "We don't care about the color." He will also paraphrase Acts 17:26. It's nothing to do with the blood, for of one blood has God made all flesh. We're all a part of the broader human family. When William McCary persists, saying that he doesn't have any leadership positions within Mormonism, Brigham Young will respond by citing favorably a black priesthood holder as evidence that Mormons don't discriminate in even distributing priesthood authority. We have one of the best elders, Brigham Young tells William McCary, an African in Lowell, a barber. He's speaking of Q. Walker Lewis, who lives in the Lowell, Massachusetts branch. He is described by Brigham Young as one of the best elders, an African in Lowell, Massachusetts. He's a barber by trade. His ads in Massachusetts newspapers substantiate that. He was ordained an elder by William Smith, an apostle, and Joseph Smith's younger brother. So as late as March 1847, we have an open racial vision. Lesson number 2, outsiders believed Mormons were too inclusive. What does this open vision look like from the outside looking in? These are some examples of editorials and newspaper articles published about Mormons during those first couple of decades. These are not celebrations of Mormon diversity. Mormons accepted all nations and colors when charge leveled against them. Mormon elders maintained communion with the Indians and walked out with colored women, something that missionaries in the South were accused of. Mormons welcomed all classes and characters into their society. They included aliens by birth and people from different parts of the world as members of God's earthly family. Mormons honored, quote, the natural equality of mankind without accepting the native Indians or the African race. They did what the rest of white society knew should not be done. Native Americans are being excluded with the Indian Exclusion Acts in 1830, and obviously African Americans are being enslaved, and yet Mormons are welcoming them in, is the accusation leveled against them. The Mormons opened an asylum for rogues and vagabonds and free blacks when charged in the state of Missouri. Mormons even promoted black ascendancy over the whites, is another accusation. Especially after Mormons openly announced the practice of polygamy in 1852, this takes on a new life. These accusations take on a new life. As outsiders look in, they imagine that Mormon polygamy is not merely destroying the traditional family, it's destroying the white race. John C. Calhoun argues on the floor of the United States Senate that democracy is the government of a white race, and people who are not white are incapable of practicing democracy. So what you're really doing then, if you're suggesting that Mormons facilitate race mixing, you're not just challenging a suspect religious sect, you are suggesting that they are making America unfit for democracy. So a variety of political cartoons that imagine what the Mormon family, polygamous family, must have looked like in the 19th century. This is published in 1870 in John Sherwood's A Comic History of the United States. And it's simply titled A Mormon Family Out for a Walk. You have the enfeebled male patriarch out front, the long string of wives behind, and then the seemingly endless string of children. But it's not the number of wives and children that we should pay attention to, but it's the blatant interracial nature of this imagined Mormon family. A stereotypical black mammy from the plantation south, an Asian wife, and Native American or Pacific Islander wife. Mormon polygamy not merely destroying the traditional family, destroying the white race and making it unfit for democracy. Lesson number 3, the priesthood and temple restrictions developed over time in fits and starts. Certainly then we can look to Brigham Young for the beginnings, but we should understand if you are accused of not being white enough in the 19th century, the most significant way you claim whiteness for yourself is in distance from blackness. And we see Mormons moving across the course of the 19th century away from their own black converts towards whiteness, or an effort at claiming whiteness for themselves. Brigham Young first openly announces a race-based priesthood restriction to the territorial legislature in January and February of 1852. He is in a debate with Apostle Orson Pratt. They are debating the servant code, which is designed to govern a relationship between the white slave masters and the black slaves who have been brought to Utah Territory. Some of those black slaves baptized Latter-day Saints themselves. And Orson Pratt moves that this bill be rejected in its entirety. He argued that God administered divine curses and that they were particular to a given time and place. They were not multi-generational. He then said, "Shall we take then the innocent African that has committed no sin and damn him to slavery and bondage without receiving any authority from heaven to do so?"
One more time with folks in the back.
He found the idea preposterous and said it was enough to cause the angels in heaven to blush. Each succeeding, Brigham Young obviously wins out in that debate. Each succeeding generation of leaders then simply refuse to violate the precedent established by Brigham Young, even though Brigham Young's precedent is a violation of the open priesthood ordination established by Joseph Smith. We get all the way to the beginning of the 20th century and you have the solidification, I believe, of these race-based priesthood and temple restrictions in place under Joseph F. Smith. Brigham Young, responsible for its beginnings, Joseph F. Smith, responsible for its solidification. In 1879, he actually interviewed Elijah Abel and verified that he had priesthood certificates substantiating his status as a black priesthood holder. In 1895, he reminded LDS leaders that Abel was ordained to the priesthood, quote, at Kirtland under the direction of the prophet Joseph Smith. Then the slippage begins. In 1904, he called Abel's ordination a mistake that was never corrected. In 1908, he claimed that Abel's priesthood ordination was declared null and void by the prophet himself. What you're doing then is you are putting the race-based priesthood and temple restrictions in place from the beginning in this new memory. They have always been in place. God put them in place. Man can't do anything about it, and it will take a revelation to get rid of them. That becomes the new memory for the 20th century. Priesthood and temples have always been white. and Mormons then pass as white and successfully claim whiteness for themselves. At the very same meeting, Joseph F. Smith decided that missionaries, quote, should not take the initiative in proselyting among the Negro people, but if Negroes or people tainted with Negro blood apply for baptism themselves, they might be admitted to church membership in the understanding that nothing further can be done for them. Joseph Smith says, unto every creature. And you see then by the beginning of the 20th century how much this open space has been diminished as Mormons are attempting to claim whiteness for themselves, and you understand why Mormonism becomes known as a white church by the 20th century. So what does this mean, and who cares? Why does this matter? We should just move forward. Obviously, you're talking to a historian, and a historian will never believe that we should just move forward without actually understanding our racial past. The LDS Church disavowed in 2013 the theories advanced in the past from the 19th century about curse of Cain and fence sitter and less valiant in the war in heaven. However, what does this mean since 1978? And what I have seen is a variety of new justifications for the previous priesthood and temple restrictions crop up to replace those that have been disavowed, and it's like playing whack-a-mole at the carnival. If we don't understand our racial history, we will continue to try these kind of justifications. That's why the history matters. Let me give you some examples. Justification number one that I've heard: spread the gospel in stages. First Jews, then Gentiles, as parallel to, well, first the gospel was to go to the white people and then to the black people. This idea either ignores the history or is ignorant of it. The first documented black person the first documented black person joined the church in 1830, the founding year of the faith. There was no parallel to Jews first, then Gentiles. It was always taken to black people, and black people were ordained in the early days of the church. The notion that the gospel would be taken in stages, white first, then blacks, and parallel to Jews first, then Gentiles, is patently false and historically inaccurate. Number two, God has always discriminated in distributing priesthood power. The tribe of Levi is parallel. The tribe of Levi analogy is a false parallel because none of the other tribes were prevented from partaking of the ordinances necessary for their salvation, like temple and priesthood restrictions prevented black people of African descent from doing. The Levites were in essence the Old Testament equivalent of modern-day temple workers, not the equivalent of modern-day priesthood holders. Their assignment was to care for and serve in the tabernacle and facilitate the keeping of the law of Moses by the other tribes. Their function was to welcome the other tribes into the tabernacle and help them to make their sacrifices as prescribed by the law. The tribe of Levi welcomed the other tribes in, while the priesthood and temple bands kept black men and women out. As Mormon scholar Artis Parshall puts it, restricting priesthood to one narrow part of the faithful is not the same as restricting priesthood from one narrow part of the faithful. Number three, giving black people access to temple and priesthood would have brought down the church. This idea suggests that conforming to American racial norms and prejudices was necessary for the church to survive. However, the same year, 1852, that Brigham Young openly announced a racial priesthood ban, the church openly acknowledged that its members believed in and practiced polygamy. Polygamy brought considerable scorn from the nation and did not end until the federal government nearly ground the LDS Church into dust. And yet LDS leaders willfully stood against the crush of derision for what they believed to be a divine principle. Why would conforming to racial prejudices be necessary for the church to survive, but conforming to prevailing marital norms not necessary? Mormons love to quote Joseph Smith's standard of truth from the Wentworth letter, wherein he says, "The standard of truth has been erected. No unhallowed hand can stop the work from progressing. Persecutions may rage, mobs may combine, armies may assemble, calumny may defame, but the truth of God will go forth boldly, nobly, and independent, till it has penetrated every continent, visited every clime, swept every country, and sounded in every ear, till the purposes of God shall be accomplished, and the great Jehovah shall say, the work is done. So no unhallowed hand can stop the work from progressing, and yet treating black people equally would have. A revelation removed the restrictions, therefore a revelation must have started them. This idea suggests that the ending of the restrictions explain the beginnings. I do not have to first tell my children to touch a hot stove before I tell them, don't touch that, it's hot. If there was a revelation to begin the restriction, can we read it? Right. Will someone show it to us? Can anyone point to it? Where is it? There is a total of one revelation on race in the priesthood in the LDS scriptural canon, and it came in June 1978, and it returned Mormonism to its racially universal roots. God will not allow the prophet to lead the church astray. Justification number 5. Taken within its proper context, this comes out of Wilford Woodruff in 1890, who was defending the manifesto ending polygamy as a revelation in the face of accusations from fellow Mormons that he was a fallen prophet and had merely bowed to political pressure when he issued the manifesto. Within this proper context, Woodruff was saying, God will not give me a revelation to lead the church astray. Assuming that a prophet is infallible is a violation of the central Mormon tenet of agency. If a prophet has agency, a prophet can make mistakes. Number 6, Mormon leaders were trapped by historical circumstances. Everyone was racist back then. This idea is based on the premise that we should not judge historical figures by the standards of today, but by the standards of their day. It is not an act of presentism that is, presentism as historians define it, is superimposing present-day values and understandings on the past. It's not an act of presentism to hold those leaders accountable for their choices because people in the past argued against slavery and for racial equality, including eventually Joseph Smith. Also, Joseph Smith sanctioned the ordination of black men to the priesthood. He was not trapped by historical circumstances. Brigham Young said in 1847, we don't care about the color. Therefore, when he started to care about color, he was not trapped by the views of the time because he had already expressed an open view. Brigham Young said, we have one of the best elders in African. When he later restricted priesthood from black men, he was not trapped by history because he had already favorably referred to a black priesthood holder. And number 7, we don't know why. Brigham Young said he knew why. On the 5th of February, 1852, if there never was a prophet or apostle of Jesus Christ spoken before, I tell you this people that are commonly called Negroes are the children of Cain. I know they are. I know they cannot bear rule in the priesthood in the first sense of the word. Anytime someone offers a new justification for the racial restrictions, President Gordon B. Hinckley's probing question to the priesthood brethren of the LDS Church in 2006 is a good response. Hinckley asked, how can any man holding the Melchizedek priesthood arrogantly assume that he is eligible for the priesthood, whereas another man lives a righteous life, but whose skin is of a different color is ineligible? And he's speaking to men in particular, but we can use gender-inclusive language. How can any man or a woman holding a temple recommend or the Melchizedek priesthood arrogantly assume that she or he is eligible for the priesthood or temple, whereas another who lives a righteous life but whose skin is of a different color is ineligible? What Hinckley's question helps us to see is that the prior restrictions were based on arrogant assumptions grounded in racism. New attempts to justify the prior restrictions, no matter how well-meaning, are therefore arrogantly assuming that a white man was eligible for the priesthood, white women for the temple, whereas another who lived a righteous life but whose skin was of a different color was ineligible. Every justification is grounded in the same arrogant assumption. Rather than continuing to invent new justifications, mostly white Mormons like me would do better spending time learning the history of the racial restrictions and then contemplating Hinckley's question and asking it of ourselves over and over and over again. Thank you.
Let me say a little bit more about my name, since Alice brought it up.
Will you change the spelling of it now?
So, James 4X and Amelia X named their little boy Ahmed Salim X. Anybody know what the X stands for? What's that? Unknown. How about James 4X? That was my father. Anybody know what that means? Anybody? Yeah, James 4X. My father was James 4X in Mosque number 12 in North Philly. Anybody? It means he was the fourth James in that mosque. Malcolm was the first in his mosque. Otherwise, he would have been Malcolm 2X or 3X or whatever. So, Malcolm, incidentally, I learned in recent, actually about 15 years ago, that Malcolm held me as a baby when I was a baby. I knew enough about the Nation of Islam not to ask if there are any pictures. Because anybody who knew anything about the Nation of Islam knew that we didn't take pictures for various reasons, most of which was, the primary one of which was that there was a deep distrust of government and of what these pictures would be used for, and everyone was under investigation at the time. And it was a very distrustful time. I grew up in a very sort of distrustful household and family, and we had reason to be. We were in North Philly and West Philadelphia. On the playground is where I spent most of my days. Chilling out, maxing and relaxing, all cooling. LaShawn does that to me. But my sister wrote I said, Gigi, do you remember where Tony, Gigi, and then my parents basically joined the Nation of Islam, and then Ahmed, Samira, Amina, Rashida, we're 10 children. Jamil, Halima, Hassan, and then we joined the church in 1980, and then Matthew is number 10. You know, it would have been great with like Moroni or Brigham or something, but... So this is our family history as determined by our names. Where is that? It's really beautiful. I wasn't even going to share it. But the Spirit moves you. If the Spirit moves you, let me groove you, right? Anybody know where that's from? Okay. she said, I love you, big. All right. You know what? I am not finding it. I didn't plan on reading it. If I find it a little later, I'll share it with you. Oh, here it is. No, it's not. So my older sister, Gigi, was watching me, and I said, hey, Gigi, Tony, you guys remember anything about this? Because I have a letter from my mother, which is in my journal, her describing the experience. It happened a couple times. But anyway, I'm not coming out with it. But she had a beautiful recollection of it, which was that he said, all praises due to Allah for such a fine son. Held me up. You know, I felt like, Simba or something in the movie. You're going to hear a lot from me that's very, very different from what you've heard from black members of the church. And that's okay. We're sophisticated enough as a black community to say different things, to have different perspectives, and to hear each other still civilly. We just had the President and the NAACP call on everybody for greater civility and racial harmony, so we can practice that as well in the LDS family and in the black family. Let me, but this is our topic, and this was my assignment. Let me go to number 2. And forgive me, this is not going to be very elegant, because I didn't realize that I needed to do this in a different way. But let me just start with this. There it is.
In the meridian of time, and again in the latter days, the Lord has stressed this essential doctrine of equal opportunity.
Oh, this is... This doesn't come over here. This is it.
Anybody get a light?
This is it.
Vote.
There it is.
I want to be a light here.
Think that'll work?
I think we got sound.
There we go.
In the meridian of time, and again in the latter days, the Lord has stressed this essential doctrine of equal opportunity for His children. And tonight, President Obert reminded us, the Lord will have none that come unto Him, black and white, bond and free, male and female, all are alike unto God. On every continent and across the isles of the sea, faithful people are being gathered into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Differences in culture, language, gender, race, and nationality fade into insignificance as the faithful enter the common path and come to our beloved Redeemer, the Lord Jesus Christ. Ultimately, we realize that only the comprehension of the true fatherhood of God can bring full appreciation of the true brotherhood of men and the true sisterhood inspires us with passionate desire to build bridges of cooperation instead of walls of segregation. It is my prayer and blessing that I leave upon all who are listening, that we may overcome any burdens of prejudice and walk uprightly with God and with one another in perfect peace and harmony. In the sacred name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
I wanted to start with that one because what we what we really are talking about here is a vision. And what is the vision? I think that we don't have to guess what the vision is or what divine, what church leaders are thinking. They said it. Perfect peace and harmony among us, brothers and sisters. And so how do we, the real question is how do we get there? Let me tell you a little bit of some of the backstories of some of these events. On the B1 event, I was in the room with the First Presidency when this was presented. There's one member of our committee here. LaShawn, anyone else? Just you and I? Darius. Is Darius here? Tracy's here? Darius. So there are four of us. Okay. So when this was presented to the First Presidency, the proposition was, let's have an event that commemorates, this is the 40th anniversary. In some cases, this is probably more important than the 50th because of the symbolism of 40 and probation, 40 years, 40 days, etc. And they completely agreed. There was an open door. Let me just tell you some things that I don't know that anyone else can, because they weren't there. Only two of us in the meeting, Rick Turley and me. There was an absolute open door. There's a lot of speculation about what they think and what they say and what they feel and what goes on in these meetings. But let me just tell you what happened. There was nothing that was presented that was denied. And everything that was presented was enthusiastically accepted. And in fact, it was the president himself who said, this is something we're talking, is it commemoration? Is it marking the 40th anniversary? He said, this is something that we should celebrate. We should celebrate our unity. We should celebrate this revelation that didn't just bless black people, but the whole world and the whole church. We're all blessed because of this revelation, because God spoke. And so that's part of the backstory. Let me tell you about this one a little bit. Brethren, the national officers of the NAACP are going to be here. By the way, you're hearing us all say NAACP because the NAACP is trying to say NAACP. Don't think that we don't get it. So the president himself said, yeah, we're trying to say NAACP, and so if you could help us with that, we'd appreciate it. The president of the NAACP, that is. So I personally presented this to the First Presidency, and we talked about some things they might say in their statement, in this joint statement with this iconic, oldest black civil rights organization in the country. And as we were discussing the language, the First Presidency said, we should not only call for increased civility and racial and ethnic harmony, but an elimination to all prejudice. Not everyone will know that. You now do. That the elimination of prejudice was their idea. which they brought up. And I added it into the statement as directed by them. In the course of this whole, of these events, President Oaks shared something, he and I just had a moment together in his office, and he shared something with me. He said, you know, on one occasion, as you know, he's a law professor in Chicago. He said, on one occasion, I was in one of the wards. It was a predominantly or a largely black ward, and and there was this event. I don't think it was a sacrament meeting, but there was an event, and everyone started singing, "We Shall Overcome," and I joined in, and it was one of the, to him, it was a pivotal moment in his life. To hear, imagine this man, the second elder of the church, the person who, if, God forbid, President Nelson passes tomorrow, would be president of the church, telling me that as we were singing, "We Shall Overcome," I was so moved. I was so impressed. I was a part of it. It's a historic thing in my life. It changed me. Just some glimpses into the, I don't know them, we're not bosom buddies, we don't hang out on Friday night or anything like that, but just some glimpses into a little bit more deeply into what was behind some of these events. Well, here's what I think the vision is, and here's how I think we can get to it. I think God's pattern seems to be to start with something small, and then a small, committed, covenant-keeping group, and then raise them up before the world as an example. You know, light of the world, salt of the earth, ensign to the nations, that kind of model. This is how I see it. And this is how I see the role that black people, and in particular African Americans, and President Oaks himself singled out African Americans in his talk in the B1 event, if you recall, if you saw it. I think what the vision is, I think what their vision is, and I think what God's vision is, if I may be so presumptuous in this secular setting, is to unite us in the church across race and ethnicity and every other characteristic or attribute. I think he first wants to unite us. Then he can more effectively unite the country, the United States I'm talking about. And then he can more effectively unite all of his children throughout the world. So it really, I'm convinced that it really starts with blacks in the church and whites in the church. These are the two groups that'll sort of attract the most attention if we were completely unified, as far-fetched as that may seem to some people. I actually believe in this vision. I actually think it can be done, and endeavor to share some ways I think it can be. So let me speed up a little bit. One of them is to just follow this message. I say unto you, be one, and if you're not one, you're not mine, which President Nelson shared at this event, which President Oaks also reiterated at the B1 event. Here you see President Nelson holding the arm of Dr. Amos Brown, chairman of interreligious relations, intergroup relations for the NAACP. How do we achieve this vision? Clayton Christensen, a Harvard business professor, sort of the Harvard business professor, wrote several books on disruptive technologies. He said that, you know what, you got to look out there, and you can't just do the same old thing, react in the same old way, and just be reflexive about what you do. You have to see change, and you have to adapt to it. If everything is knee-jerk and nothing ever changes, if we just say the same old thing and act the same old way, even though things are changing, in the marketplace, people go out of business. In our case, we could become just increasingly irrelevant. He was, by the way, I had the privilege of having him as my Area 70 for 2 or 3 years when I was stake president. We need to see the revelation on the priesthood, in President Oak's words, as a divine call to abandon attitudes of prejudice against any group of God's children. He noted that racism was the most common. We need to desire to abandon racist attitudes. As in President Oak's words, repent of it. We need to pray for a sense of sorrow about harboring such attitudes. If we don't feel any bad about that or whatever, if we struggle with these things, I'm just going to go through these quickly. Darius Gray did a wonderful job at identifying ways in which we can tell if we have some of these attitudes or some of the manifestations of racism. We can relate racism and prejudice to gospel principles and covenants and incorporate, see that as sinful and see our covenant keeping see overcoming racism as part of keeping our covenants. We can understand what the Book of Mormon calls our own nothingness, in addition to being a child of God. We can recognize that racism and prejudice are forgivable sins and work on them as needed. We can know that we're loved by our Heavenly Father and by our brothers and sisters. We can seek to be patient and gracious toward those who may be impatient with that particular sin. We can deepen our faith and trust in church leaders. And this is interesting because I find that the newer we are in the church, and this even is the case with some long-term members, the less we sort of understand how to relate to a prophet or to an apostle. It's kind of like, you kind of relate to them as you did your pastor around the corner or whatever, if we're converts to the church. It's a different relationship. We can change with the opportunity. As I said, don't be reflexive. Brother Gray did that last night. He had kind of one talk prepared, but pivoted in light of recent events. We have to be able to do that, and it was wise to do that. We can, let me get through. Do we have
time?
We need to look at, and I'm talking, you'll notice that I'm not saying if you're white, if you're black. And this is to whoever it applies to. Okay. We need to be careful that we're not bringing our own anger issues, our own distrustfulness, our own suspicion, that we're not anybody's victim. We're self-actualizing, self-motivating people who are in control of our own destiny.
Ahmad.
I'm done, okay? So I'm going to conclude with this one. Abraham Maslow said, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. There are times when a screwdriver is needed. There are times when a glass cutter is needed. If you're using a hammer on a job where a glass cutter is needed, it's obviously you're going to do more damage than good. We're at a point in the church's history where and I had all kinds of statements and quotes. We heard 3 times from President Oakes, who gave us a special invitation to look forward. Don't let that phrase be transformed into a code phrase that now you feel you're uncomfortable using. Look forward. Look forward. I'm not saying that this is all in the rest of this, and so I feel a little bad because Paul and I have had private discussions about history. I'm not near the historian he is, but I'm not saying that we don't look back to examine history. We absolutely do. It's all about the purpose for which we look back. If we look back to blame, if we look back to satisfy our our anger, if we look back to feel the pain, then
Pioneer Day.
that's right. On the other hand, if we look back to celebrate people's faith in every footstep, if we look back, if we count Jane's 7 times that she was denied a temple ceiling, if we look back at that to say, see how bad them white people were, we've lost it. If we look back at that to say, see how powerful that woman's faith was, my faith should be half that strong, then we're looking back for the right purpose. Let me leave it there, because Alice is going to get a hook out. Thank you very much. I'm just taking this to the end, Alice.
You can just leave it there and do it later.
I just shut it.
Let's just talk about Genesis. I was in Columbus, Ohio in 2003, and my wife and I, we were trying to figure out why so many black folk would join the church only to leave. I saw white members leave the church and become disgruntled Mormons, ex-Mormons. And the frustration they felt generally had to do with something they didn't like, or the way that they were treated, or someone said something to them. But there was a different spirit when I saw black folks leave the church that had joined, and I didn't understand it. And my wife and I prayed and cried a little bit and prayed a little more and wondered what we could do. And 2 sister missionaries brought us a handful of rolled up paper and asked us to take a look at this to see if we knew anything about it or we had heard about it. And it was the information on the Genesis group, and it had a black family in this picture. And they were in front of the Salt Lake Temple. And I had seen nothing like that before. And I asked the sisters, what was this Genesis group that they were talking about? And she said, I'm not sure, but we got this information and we wanted to bring it to you. And as my wife and I researched it, we found out it was actually presented by Darn Evanson, I believe it was, who was an ex-Mormon of the Baha'i faith. But Darius Gray's name was attached to it in his email, as well as Marvin Perkins. And I emailed all of these brethren and told them I had gotten this information, and I can feel Darius staring at me right now. And Darius didn't contact me back, but Marvin did. And Marvin said to me, he said, bruh, do you know that I almost didn't respond to you simply because of who you referred to? And I had no idea what he was talking about, but he was speaking of Dark Evanson and the activities that, I guess he was a security risk from the church or something, had been going on. And we talked on the phone, Marvin and I, and eventually I had an opportunity to email and talk with President Gray, and I was introduced to the Genesis group through both of those brothers. And I wondered why something like this didn't exist all over the church. Why was it just in Utah? And so, of course, being the good Mormon I was at that point, I went to my bishop and I asked my bishop, had he heard of the Genesis group? And this was in 2003, toward the end, beginning of 2004. And my bishop said, no, I've heard nothing about it. And went to the stake president, and he heard nothing about it. And I said, well, I'd ordered all these books, and I didn't know these books were written by Dark. And in actuality, he sent me the books free. And I started reading the book, and I was like, wow, I didn't know any of this information. And I shared it with my bishop. He shared it with the stake president. And I told the bishop and stake president, I said, I'd like to start a Genesis group here in Columbus, Ohio. And you can imagine the joy on their face and the manifestation of spiritual holiness in their heart when I shared this wonderful information about black folks coming together and sharing their experiences and talking about how culturally, the cultural discomfort we felt joining the church and trying to have somebody to lean on. They were all for that. Yeah, right. No. So they begin to do what most leaders in the church do. Pass the buck. You need to talk to this person. When you talk to this person says you need to talk to this person, and this person says you need to talk to this person. Ain't it funny how the leaders can all of a sudden find out that they're not really leaders and they're not really in charge when a decision needs to be made, when it's concerning black folks in the church? Okay, see? So the buck got passed all the way up to Merrill Bates, I believe his name is. This is who you need to get the authorization from. And all I knew about Brother Bates is that he was in Utah. And I ain't had no money to get to Utah, and I know the church wasn't going to buy me no ticket. And I didn't know if he'd answer my call when I was talking about the Genesis group. So, after about a 3-year struggle, we found out that the brethren said that they don't want a church inside the church. This was the information I got. That the Genesis group is just in Utah, and that's where it's going to remain, because we don't want a church inside of the church. Now I'm really confused. Because if you got a Genesis group, that it already exists, but you don't want to spread it out because you don't want a church inside. It sounds like to me you already got a church inside of your church. So are you really saying you don't want it to grow and become a bigger church inside of your church? What are you really saying to me? And they said, well, we're not saying that. Not saying that. We're just saying that it's only authorized in Utah, and we're not going to authorize it outside of Utah. Something to help you. You see black folks leaving after 3 and 4 months. And you have an organization that can help, that is helping, and will help, but you don't want to let that grow. So I didn't want to take no for an answer, and I didn't take no for an answer, and I was like, there gotta be a way. And so Darius Gray and Marvin Perkins, we all put our head together. And we came up with an idea. Can we just have a chapter? Take that back to you, Bishop. Bishop, since you don't want to authorize, and the stake president won't authorize, and the brethren don't want to authorize another church inside of the church, can we just have a chapter inside of the church? Going back and forth, going back and forth, going back and forth and back and forth. After about 3 years, Darius Gray graced our presence in Columbus, Ohio. A few weeks after the Columbus, Ohio temple was built, right across the street from the Columbus, Ohio temple in one of the Columbus stakes. And we had our first Genesis chapter meeting in about 2005. And guess who they made the president of the chapter? Yeah, it was only two of us, me and my wife. They didn't give us any ecclesiastical authority, but Genesis has no ecclesiastical authority anyway. So I was cool with that. But after all of the hustle and the bustle of organizing this Genesis group in Columbus, Ohio, I was tired. I was wore out because I felt like I was still sitting in the back of the bus. But in Ohio, I was a bus driver. In society, I was a bus driver. That was my profession. But in the church, I had to go to the back. I had to ask white folks for permission to worship with my brothers and sisters culturally the way we know how to worship from here. And that hurt, because I couldn't understand why I had to ask white folks for permission to serve my Heavenly Father when you don't understand my struggle. And so, yeah, we heard all of the stuff about, well, yeah, you know, that happened a long time ago. You was never a slave and this and that and the other. But history affects us. If not, you wouldn't have Pioneer Day. So, after the struggle of starting the Genesis group in Dayton or Columbus, Ohio, my wife and I were frustrated. We moved to Virginia, and I started a financial planning or a mortgage company down in Virginia during the mortgage uprise, and everybody's making all the money. And we were so tired, my wife and I said, you know what, baby, we just gonna sit in the pew. I'm not arguing with no more white folks about starting no Genesis group or nothing. We're gonna go to church, we're gonna take the sacrament, and we're gonna carry our happy black behinds home, and that's all we gonna do. Well, so happened we got to Virginia, and when we got to Virginia, they were having a state conference. So we went to the state conference. That first Sunday we were there, and the state president walked right up to me and my wife and said, hey, so glad to have you. How are you? Well, we're doing well. Thank you so much, President. He said, and this was President Dudley, by the way, who's now an area authority. President Dudley said, have you heard of the Genesis group? No, he didn't. My wife looked at me and I looked at her and she was like, are you for real? He said, have you heard of the Genesis group? And we looked at each other and we looked back at the president and we said, yeah, we have, President. He said, awesome, we want to start one here. Have you talked to baby? Do you know the struggle we're about to have? I'm like, oh Lord, no, not again. We had the first meeting in his house, and it grew, and we ended up with probably about 40 or 50 members. But the problem was not only in Ohio, but in Columbus, Ohio, but in Virginia, a lot of the white members said, well, that doesn't affect us, so we're not coming. And what happened to bear one another's burdens? I thought we were supposed to bear one another's burdens. When Sandy Hook happened, in sacrament meeting for the testimony service, white folks got up and bore their testimony and was crying about the tragic of it and how devastating they were and how they were checking on their family members and this and that and the other. When Trayvon Martin happened and me and my wife came unglued, they were just like, why? What's the matter with you? That didn't happen to you. Trayvon Martin was fighting. He got what he deserved. Really? You mean to tell me, with the same mouth you bear your testimony with, you gonna tell me with that same mouth this boy just got what he deserved? They say the devil got a forked tongue. See, he just happened to say what he feel. I gotta wrap this up because I don't want to be assassinated.
Wayne.
But it gets frustrated. I know my time is up. It's been gone. It's been gone. So let me say this. Genesis has been able to be a resource for my family. And when we got let go, y'all know they released the whole presidency. Every last one of us got released. When in church history has that happened? Did the first presidency, the whole first presidency, don't nobody know what's going on, don't nobody know how to do the barbecue, don't nobody know what you gotta ask everybody else. You gonna release everybody? In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.
We have very little time, so I'm torn between, should we ask for one or two questions, or should we ask the panelists to each give an idea, a suggestion of one thing that the church needs to do to go forward? Let's do one question, and we'll do one question here. LaShawn, did you have a question? Okay, LaShawn, did you want to go ahead and do your question?
I would love that.
Okay.
Here's my question. I think with the information the statement that the church made about Charlottesville, that white supremacy is sinful and not in connection with or in alignment with the gospel in 2017. Yet we have documentation from Dr. Reeve and other historians that we did have racist and white supremacist doctrine and ideas in 1850, whatever it was.
Right.
How do we have that conversation? Because I think anybody that wants to can use that against us to say, okay, you might not have it today in 2017, but you yourselves were not in alignment with your own gospel in the 1850s, and we act like we speak on it right now, but we have our own amnesia and do not speak of what we said before. Like, how do we have that conversation? Because for me, that's the discrepancy that I think we're so excited the church said white supremacy that we're not recognizing, oh, but actually Brigham Young said this, and actually, Harold B. Lee said this. Like, we're forked tongues, both sides of our mouth, saying now. Saying now.
So I think President Hinckley's quote is a great way to talk through that. How can any man, and is that question only acceptable post-1978? And that's what we need to start asking, right? This is President Hinckley who asked the question. And we need to help people understand, right, what does that imply? He's talking about an arrogant assumption, and it's grounded in racism. And how can any man, Brigham Young, how can any man, Joseph F. Smith, arrogantly assume, right? And those are hard conversations. Just tried to have one in my ward last week. And, mixed responses. But nonetheless, those are the kind of hard conversations we need to have and help people understand, right, there is a history to this. It's not just 2018, but in fact, there's a reason why we're at where we're at right now, and we need to grapple with the fact that we taught, produced, practiced racism within Mormonism, right, for us to be able to move forward with that informed past.
Was there another question? Go ahead.
So, I remember George B. Hinckley saying racism is a sin on more than one occasion. I think we have to look back and repent and atone. And I didn't hear that in the list of things. Don't look back to do this. Don't look back to do that. Don't look back to do this. But I think any possibility for repentance and atonement can only come if we recognize the sins that we've enumerated that weigh down our past and weigh down our ability to look at another human being and see first their humanity.
Okay, go ahead.
I have a question about Genesis. I mean, disclaimer, I'm not black, in case you can't tell. So, it's always seemed a wonderful idea to me, but at the same time, I think, so I grapple with this. I remember when President Faust said in General Conference, our spiritual unity is more important than our cultural diversity. And which I perfectly understand. So I always wonder, who else do we carve out? Or who else do we? I mean, if people want to carve out a thing for Asian Latter Day Saints,
No one else will say
Okay, good. Let him finish his question. Go ahead. We have little time, so go ahead and go directly.
It's a great idea. I just don't know where. I have that dichotomy thing. We're supposed to be unified, and hopefully we want to all be unified. And so, are we delaying unification by carving things out, or are we? I'm just asking the question.
Okay, I want to answer one part of that, and then I'm going to go to Wayne and let Wayne give a response to this, because I know that Wayne has a response. Are you aware that, I know here in Utah there are lots, but in other states as well, there are Asian wards, there are Philippine wards, there is a couple of African wards, there is a Brazilian ward, there are Hispanic wards. Do you feel the same way regarding those wards and those branches that they have been, that those ethnicities have been carved out from the church, the same way that you feel that this is what Genesis is doing? That's the question that I give to you. I'm not asking you to answer that right now here in public, but I'd like you to answer that question for yourself, because therein is an answer that, brother, I think you need. And I'm going to turn to Wayne and let Wayne comment.
When I was a kid, I played Monopoly. And when you play Monopoly, when you get toward the end of the game, the person that got all the property and all the money all of a sudden gets real nice. Say, why can't we just all be friends? We don't have to argue. We don't have to fight. Let's just be united. N-word, you got all the money. So, of course, you want to negotiate, you want to be nice, and you want to be civilized now. But when you was getting that property, when you was getting that money, you wasn't nice. Now you want to be nice? Now you want to get along? I'm broke. I'm economically challenged. I'm oppressed. Now you want to be nice? You wasn't nice when you hung my mama. You wasn't nice when you raped my sister. So I didn't do none of that.
We are pretty much out of time. Ahmad, Ahmad, I'm going to give you 1.1 minutes.
Seconds.
1.1 minutes to respond.
Thank you. Somebody said that's 2 minutes too long. Let me address that. We need more sophistication in the black community. We need to be able to hear disparate ideas and thoughts. One thing I admire about the Jewish community, which I practice law with, is that there's so many different ideas. They're all Jews, right? There's a lot of ways to do things, and we need more of that in the black community. I admire our unity. but sometimes it can be.
We have that in the black community.
Exactly. That's what
got
I'm saying.
that community.
I admire
We don't-
that.
we don't need it. We have
I
it.
admire the unity, but sometimes we go, let me see what the black winds are saying. Let's not do that. We have thoughts, we have minds, we can. And by the way, I just spent 3 years inviting people to repentance, and myself. The main thing about the church is a call to repentance. It's a call to come unto Christ. We've been talking mainly about social issues, but that's the purpose of the church, is reason for being. And so as we go about these things, let's remember whose church it is, and let's try to do it, adopt his attributes as we go about building unity and relating to those who have different opinions.
Thank you so much for We're going to let Paul give us instructions for lunch and when we need to return.
Okay.